follows on media. This is Coming Out Stories. It's a podcast about one of the most important conversations of your life. I'm Emma Goswell. Time now for writer and broadcaster Iain Dale, who came out a bit later in life. And as you'll find out in this interview, he believes it really did impact on his political career.
I was 7 or 8 years old, so I always knew that I was different to other people, but I didn't actually do anything about it until I was 28, which you have to think, I'm 57 now, so we're talking about the 70s and early 80s. And I grew up in quite a conservative little village near Saffron Walden in Essex. And there were no gays in the village. I'm sure there were, but I didn't know them. And I remember at Saffron Walden County High School, nobody used the word gay. You were a Ted. That was the word that was used because there was a guy who lived in Saffron Walden who was known as being gay, and his name was Ted. So.
I was going to say that's the first time I've ever heard that term.
Yeah. And everyone knew where he lived, and everyone stayed away from that place. And that was really, I suppose, the first time that I kind of encountered the whole concept, even though I knew I was different. I'm not sure, did I know that I fancied boys rather than girls? I think I probably did. Now, that didn't stop me having girlfriends, and quite a lot of girlfriends. But it never quite progressed. How shall I put this? Well, I never had penetrative sex with a girl. Did lots of other things, but didn't do that. And that was the end of the relationship. And I don't know whether they thought I was religious or what. I mean, I wasn't at all religious. But it just got to a point where I just didn't want to go any further.
And were you doing this and going with girls because you felt pressurised doing it, or did you think you were a bit bisexual or pansexual?
I did have feelings for them. And I knew what kind of girl I liked and what kind of girl I didn't like. So from that point of view, you could say, I suppose, yes, I was bisexual, sort of. But once I discovered cock, I'm afraid there was no going back.
Fair enough. So before you were sort of being outwardly gay, were you getting bullied at all? Was anyone telling you that you were gay when you were at school in the 70s and 80s?
No, not at all, because to all intents and purposes, I was just like anyone else. I mean, I had girlfriends at university. I had girlfriends. So, and I remember my first year at university, which was in Norwich, the University of Easy Access, as it was then called. It isn't anymore, I can assure you. I was going around the Freshers' Fair in the second year and walked past the Gay Society. And a guy called Nick Crook, who ran it, engaged me in conversation. He said, well, why don't you join? I said, well, I'm not gay. So why would I join? Getting all defensive. And that was, I think, one of the first times when I thought, this is ridiculous, in that I know what I am. But this was, 1982, 3.
So you were completely lying to him and yourself, really?
Well, I wasn't lying to myself because I knew the truth, but I was lying to everybody else. And I think the longer you leave it, the more people you are lying to. And when I eventually did come out, that was my big thing, in that I'd lied to my best friends. Now, several of them had apparently guessed, but I'd lied to my family, everybody, really. So it was quite an uncomfortable position. But because I hadn't actually, even at university, I didn't do anything. Gosh. And I look back and you think, oh, my God, that was when you should have been sort of discovering everything. But I didn't.
A lot of people, when they get to university, that's their chance. And that's, when they're finally away from their parents and they're like kids in sweetie stores. So what stopped you joining that society, and what stopped you even telling your friends?
I think you have to think back to what life was like in the 70s and 80s. Well, at university, I did know a couple of gay people, but that was literally it. I had no one in my family that I knew was gay. That changed a bit later, may come on to that. I had no gay friends. And I think it's the fear of the unknown. It's like a friend of mine recently, a year or two ago, said to me, we've got Muslim neighbours moving in. I said, oh, right. He goes, no, Muslim neighbours. Sort of nudge, nudge, wink, wink. I said, what do you mean? Well, you never know what they might be into. I said, seriously?
What year is this?
Oh, yeah, exactly. And then, of course, 2 weeks later, we're chatting again. I said, how are you getting on with your neighbours? Oh, they're fantastic. We're sort of in each other's houses all the time. And it's the fear of the unknown. If you are from an ethnic minority and you walk down the high street in Cromer in North Norfolk, you will get stared at. Now, that's not because people are necessarily racist. You just look different to what they do. So in a sense, there's a sort of natural thing about it. And if you don't know gay people, it's like this myth that gay men want to shag every other man in the world. Just as if, well, actually, straight men probably do want to shag every woman in the world. But these stereotypes that exist, and you have to be incredibly camp if you're gay. Well, you and I both know that, yes, there are the stereotypes, but 95% of people don't conform to the stereotype.
You were obviously, for a better want of a better phrase, passing, weren't you? And you didn't have that sort of everyone pointing the finger at you. But for some gay men, they did have that because they literally had the limp wrist. They were very camp and over the top. But do you feel almost lucky in a way that you didn't get that and you could stay in the closet?
I wouldn't say lucky in that I now wish that I had come out a lot earlier than I did. I think life would have been quite different in some ways. I can't sit here and say it's the worst thing that I've ever done not coming out. As my life has gone on, I'm very comfortable about how my life has been. But I know, well, there are two things. I know that if I'd been born in 1952 rather than 1962, I would have probably become Philip Schofield. And we're recording this like a few days after he came out. I'm pretty sure I would have ended up married to a woman.
So you can totally understand his journey.
I can understand it, and I feel incredibly sorry for his wife. I think, and there's a lot of this about. I mean, I've done phone-ins on it on LBC, sort of married men who dabble on the side, and I think I was lucky in that I was born when I was, but in a sense, I feel unlucky that I wasn't born 20 years later, because I do think gay people nowadays really have very little excuse to stay in the closet as long as I did. Yes, of course, it's always going to be a thing to come out to your parents, particularly if you come from particular backgrounds. I mean, if you're a Muslim, for example, you come out. I mean, that is a big thing. So I do look at sort of 18, 20, 25-year-olds now and think you are so lucky to grow up in today's society. It's not the same all over the country. I think there are still issues in some very rural areas like the one I grew up in some ways. But I don't think that you would face the level of insults, bigotry that I would have done if I had come out at 18.
So what age did you live it to then, Iain?
Well, in terms of my family, I was 40.
Wow. Okay. Yeah, a little bit later.
In terms of people that I worked with and were friends in London, most of them knew sort of sometime during my 30s, but not before that, because I didn't actually do anything with another guy sexually until I was 28.
Gosh, that's a long time to wait, isn't it?
It was a long time to wait, and let's put it this way, I kind of made up for lost time a bit after that.
Were you like the proverbial kid in a sweetie shop?
Yes. Bear in mind, this was 1990, and I was going out with a woman at the time.
So can you remember the first person you came out to then?
Yes, I can. It's a friend of mine, Michael First, who is an American. I'd always known that he was gay. I'd only met him a couple of years before. And I can remember this would have been late 1990, I think, going to America, and I was determined that I was going to tell him. But I just couldn't find the right way to do it. And then I did, and he was actually a really good listener and gave me a lot of really good advice once I told him. But he was the first one that I told. And I mean, I can't really remember telling anyone else in my sort of work circles. It just sort of became, I think, an assumption on some people's part, and I just don't remember conversations about it. I did accumulate a circle of gay friends, partly through a succession of one-night stands, who some of them turned into friends. But at that stage, I could not imagine having a relationship with another guy.
Why?
I don't know. I mean, looking back on it, it's completely ridiculous. And then when I did finally have a relationship, I found it quite difficult because I wasn't out. There were certain people I couldn't be with this guy in front of. And So I've only ever had 3 actual relationships, and the one I'm in now has lasted for 25 years.
Wow.
So I just could not imagine being with someone for that length of time, particularly after I'd spent a few years sort of with just kind of random people, most of whose names I didn't even know.
So why, when you were 40, did you finally admit it to your family? Was there something that spurred it on?
This is a terrible, terrible admission, but it was because I wanted to become a Conservative MP.
Wow. Literally the only person in the world that ever came out for that reason, probably.
I'm not sure I am, actually. I just decided that I'd always wanted to either be a radio presenter or a politician. And I had had a few opportunities on the radio, but nothing ever came of it. So I sort of put that to one side. And I would have applied to be an MP a lot earlier than this, but this was in 2002. So I was 40. And I thought, well, if I don't do it now, it's going to be too late. And I thought, if I do it, I've got to come out, because otherwise somebody could have something on me at some point in my career. And there had been 1 or 2 MPs come out before that. So I decided that if I got anywhere in a selection contest, I would then tell my family. And much to my surprise, I immediately got through to the second round of Chipping Barnet. And I can remember driving up the M11 to my parents thinking, how on earth am I going to do this? And I thought I would wimp out. And I had actually told one of my sisters a few years before, because she'd been in some sort of relationship crisis. And I said, well, if you think you've got problems. And so it just sort of naturally happened. It wasn't me sitting her down and telling her something. But that proved to be a bit of an error in some ways, because when I told the other sister, I mistakenly told her that I'd already told the other one. Oh. And she didn't take that very well, which I completely get. I mean, if it'd been me, I would have been quite upset about it. So I can remember sitting my parents down and saying, well, I need to tell you something. And I said, you know, John, who I was, my partner who I was already with, he'd been to their place, he'd stayed overnight. And I can't remember exactly how the conversation went, but it was sort of, yeah, we know he's your friend. I said, no, he's more than a friend. And still the penny didn't drop. And all my other friends had said, well, of course they know already. They're your parents. Of course they will have picked up on it. And I said, well, I'm sorry, you don't know my parents. I do. And my dad was always good in a crisis. And he sort of took the line, well, if you were happy, that's the main thing, blah, blah, blah.
And he said that straight away?
Yeah. My mother, on the other hand, I will never forget just the dead look in her eyes. And, I mean, we didn't go into any great detail, but it sort of went okay-ish, I thought. And then I can remember when I was left to go home, I said to my sister, well, I think that went sort of okay. And she said, you don't know the half of it. Why? And that, you see, both of my sisters didn't want me to tell them. And I didn't, frankly, want to tell them because I knew that it would be a big thing. But I thought, well, do I not tell them? And then they read about it in the Daily Telegraph. Because at that point, if I had been selected for a constituency, which I was, I would have been the first openly gay candidate to have been actually selected and told the association that I was gay.
So it would have been a big deal then, really?
Yeah, and of course when I was selected it was a big deal. And I can remember in that Chipping Barnet selection in the first round, at the end, and I'd never done one of these selection meetings before, so I didn't know that at the end they ask you, is there anything embarrassing about your private life or business life that might cause embarrassment to the association?
Nothing apart from the fact that I'm a massive homosexual.
Well, I didn't quite put it like that. I said, well, it's not embarrassing for me, and I hope it's not embarrassing to you, but I'm gay, but I'm also a West Ham United supporter, which you might think is slightly more embarrassing. And they all roared with laughter, so I thought, oh, I got away with that. Yeah. But the agent ran out after me after I'd ended it and said, what did you do that for? He said, you've just lost some votes there. And I said, well, they asked me a question, so I answered it. Anyway, to cut a long story short, I missed out on being in the final by 2 votes. And I know now that if I hadn't done that, I would have got into the final. I would have been up against 2 women, one of whom was Theresa Villiers, currently a cabinet minister. And in those days, if it was one bloke against 2 women, the bloke always won. So the fact that I was honest, I think to this day, cost me being Member of Parliament for Chipping Barnet.
But you can't have any regrets, can you? Because surely,
no.
Same thing for being a radio presenter as being a politician. You've got to be open and honest for people.
Yeah. And I don't have any regrets. I remember that the same year, a few months later, after I had been selected in North Norfolk, which, given that is a very conservative with a small c area, was a miracle in a way. But I got 66% of the vote on the first ballot. And I mean, good on them for doing it. And I can remember at the Conservative Party conference that year, this young guy came up to me and he said, "I just want to thank you." And I said, "Why?" I'd never met him before, didn't know who he was. And he said, "Because you've made it easier for the rest of us." And if you think about it now, you could argue that proportionately, and I got into trouble with Pink News for saying this the other day, but I'm going to say it again, you could argue proportionally gay people are almost overrepresented in the House of Commons now. Now, it's a strange thing. It's a strange thing to say, but it depends whether you think that sort of 5%, 10% of the population are gay. But there are now, I think, is it 54 gay MPs out of 650? So you're getting to the point where you could make that argument. I mean, I don't, because I don't. To me, it doesn't matter whether you're gay, straight, or whatever. Can you do the job is the main thing. But that's happened in a very short space of time. I think when at that point in 2002-03, there were probably only 4 or 5 openly gay MPs. And now it doesn't hinder your selection at all, and nor should it.
So we've come a remarkably long way in just a few years then, really.
Yeah. Well, we have. I think you look at... I mean, was anyone really, apart from on the sort of fringes of the debate, was anyone arguing for gay marriage in the 1990s? I'm sure there were people, but it wasn't a big thing.
No.
It became a big thing. I mean, Tony Blair, and I paid tribute to him in my civil partnership, brought in, obviously, civil partnerships. And at that point, I probably took the view, I think I did take the view that, well, why do we need gay marriage? I mean, this is effectively marriage. And when we got our civil partnership in 2008, and both of us regarded that as being married. And we didn't actually upgrade it, convert it, whatever the phrase is, until 2015. So 2 years after the legislation came in. And it was only when my partner discovered that there were sort of slightly better pension benefits that we did.
Fair enough. So just back to your mum then, briefly, because I don't feel like we didn't finish that conversation. Did she ever vocalise her displeasure to you? Was there other conversations to be had?
No, it was never really mentioned again. She always had quite a close relationship with John. I mean, in a way, that was the saving grace, in that it wasn't like I was going to be bringing sort of random men to see them. They knew him. We've never been a touchy-feely couple. And I think that was one of my sisters said, "Well, I hope you're not going to sort of hold hands or anything watching television." I said, "Well, we don't do that at home. Why would we do that here?" One of them said to me the next day, I phoned her up and I said, "Oh, how are things?" And she said, "Well, Mum said to me that she wished she'd never woken up today." That was a hard thing to hear, yeah. Not quite sure why my sister felt the need to share that with me, but anyway. They came to the civil partnership. Can't say my mother looked particularly happy, but she came. And I would love not to have had to tell her in some ways, because there was something that... I mean, nothing changed in our relationship really, but you don't want to have things that you can't really talk about to your mother.
But you wanted her to share in your big day with you and John.
Well, I did.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And I mean, it was a very sort of idyllic day. I mean, even hired a little castle. How gay is that? And it was a real mix of sort of friends, political people, and David Davis was there, who he's kind of my best friend in politics, but should we say had some pretty antediluvian beliefs on this subject. But he was actually spotted with a tear running down his face during the ceremony, which he swears to this day was just grit. So.
Grit, yeah, of course. So you talked a lot about politics. Have you ever faced any discrimination or any issues being out and proud as a broadcaster?
Look, I do lots of gay-related phone-ins. I consider myself as a radio presenter who happens to be gay rather than a gay radio presenter. I think that there is a difference there. And I'm very conscious that I do gay-related phone-ins if there is something in the news. Now, I wasn't on air on Friday when Philip Schofield came out. Otherwise, I would have done a phone-in on are you a gay husband who pretends to be straight? Because I've done that before, and it was mainly women that phoned in, actually. As I say, I think that there's a lot of that about. I've done phone-ins on what it's like to be Muslim and gay. I mean, absolutely heartbreaking, some of the stories you hear there. Mm-hmm. And essentially, the whole idea of any phone-in that I do, particularly on this kind of subject, is to show to people who are listening that they're not alone, that any gay Muslims that are listening, they know there are other people out there. Because I'm sure if you live in a very, very closeted sort of religious background, it's quite difficult to imagine that there are other people like you.
You know, a lot of people have had it really tough. But it always seems to be that it does get better as the main... If there was sort of one overriding sort of outcome for all of my stories, is that it does get better. And I always like to end with a question of if, you know, you could talk to your younger self, or if you had any advice for other young LGBT people sort of struggling with their sexuality or gender identity, what advice would you give them, Iain?
I actually wrote a letter to my 16-year-old self a few years ago,
wow.
And I'm trying to remember what I said in it. I think the main thing is that however bad you think it's going to be, for most people it isn't. And I'm not going to pretend that there aren't some people who go through terrible times when they come out to their parents or family or even friends. I mean, my friends who I'd been friends with for, well, since I was at university, so 20, 25 years, I was really worried that I would lose them because I'd been lying to them. I don't recall a single one of my friends or family members effectively shunning me after it. Now, maybe I was lucky, I don't know. But I think they respected why I hadn't said anything, but they were glad that I eventually did. Yes, there were a few tearful moments with some people. I mean, not because they'd reacted badly, but it's obviously a very emotional thing to do. So my advice is to, I suppose, try and do it naturally, not necessarily feel you have to sit somebody down, wait for the opportunity to arise and then grab it. I mean, I can remember once with my mother, years and years before I came out, we were in the car together driving somewhere, and I could have said it then. There was something, I can't remember what the conversation was about, but I remember kicking myself and thinking, why didn't you say something then? That could have really saved a lot of heartache for her a long time into the future. So I think you do have to be a bit brave. It's not something you can rehearse particularly. That's why I say it's better if it's done in a sort of natural conversation.
And it sounds like you may have a bit of regret of not doing it sooner, and that actually you feel a lot happier now you've done it.
Yeah, if I could live my life over again, I don't have many regrets in my life, but one of them, I suppose, is that I would like to have done it earlier. Maybe not at the age of 18, because I'm not even sure I was ready to do it then. But it would have saved a bit of heartache for, shall we say, some of the girls I went out with, which, I mean, I do sort of sometimes think about them and think, God, because it's not as if I live a very sheltered life. I mean, they will all have, well, I say all, a lot of them will have read about me and think, bloody hell, I had a narrow escape there.
You were just going through it, weren't you? And that's a long time to have it in your head.
Yeah.
It can give you a lot of sort of mental sort of strife and heartache, can't it? Having all that in your head and not doing about it for years. One
thing I've never struggled with is mental health issues. I am quite an emotional person, but I've never really struggled with it. I didn't go through agonies about coming out. I always accepted who I was. I always knew that I had strengths and weaknesses. It was just something that I knew I would deal with in some way. And since I have come out, I've never been in a situation where in my sort of days of random one-night stands, I never felt guilty. I've always drawn a line between love and sex, I suppose, which most people, I think the conventional thing in society is that there isn't a line and it should involve both. I think in gay world it is a little bit different to that. So I've never gone through emotional agonies over it. I've never suffered any kind of depression for it. And I mean, mental health fascinates me as an issue, partly because I haven't ever suffered from mental health issues, at least I don't think I have.
But you know that a lot of LGBT people have.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And I know that, I mean, I had somebody ring me up late one night who'd only ever met once before, who's gay, who was about to take his own life.
Right.
And I mean, I could talk for hours about that, but I listened and talked him down, and have done that 5 or 6 times since as well. You're never quite sure you're saying the right thing, but in the end, you just listen. I mean, he was going through absolute agonies, and I've always thought, well, thank God, I've never had to deal with that kind of thing. I can remember breaking down at work one day. It's my first relationship, and this guy had just like disappeared, and I was thinking, well, why, and what have I done? And that's the only time I've ever sort of really shown any kind of sign of having any sort of issues like that.
A bit of heartbreak, but you've ended up with your happily ever after.
Yes, Princess Diana brought us together. Can
What?
you believe?
Oh, hang on, just quickly before we finish. Tell us more.
Well, I had a one-night stand with a guy called Matthew, who I met through a CompuServe forum. This was in 1994. And after doing the dirty deed, we just got chatting, and I owned a car that had been owned by Princess Diana, an Audi Cabriolet. And he said, my ex is really into cars, love to see that. So he brings John up to London they inspect my car, and I think I had a bad day at work, and I think they were expecting an invite back to my flat, which they didn't get. Anyway, John phoned me up later that evening, and the next evening, and the next evening, and well, I was actually going out with somebody at the time, although that was coming to an end. I already knew that, and we got together, and we've been together ever since, which, given that he and I have completely contrasting personalities, and our only 2 shared interests are really dogs and cars, but somehow it works. We've never had a sort of door-slamming row, which is...
Well, as Paula Abdul said, opposites attract, Ian.
Well, I think that is the case in our case. So, yeah, we've lasted 25 years in August.
That's fantastic. And all thanks, sort of, to Lady Di.
Exactly.
A massive thank you to Ian for inviting me to the studios of LBC. He's definitely the only person I've interviewed to mention Lady Diana as part of their coming out story. Please do subscribe wherever you get your podcast from. And if you want to find out more about this podcast, perhaps ask us a question or even offer yourself up for an interview, well, you can follow us at Come Out Stories on Twitter or Coming Out Stories Pod on Instagram. We'd love to hear from you. I'm Emma Goswell, and Coming Out Stories is a What Goes On media production. Next time on Coming Out Stories is Britain's first out Muslim drag queen, Asifa Lahore. She now identifies as a trans woman, but first came out as a gay man and really struggled to come out, particularly when she was pressured to get into an arranged marriage.
If you marry, then it will cure you. Like, oh, you haven't had sex with a woman yet. Once you're married and you have sex and you have children, it's kind of like that side of you you'll forget that side of you. Like, it won't ever happen.